We live in a time where everyone feels the need to explain, defend, and broadcast their every move, every thought, every opinion. People spill their feelings to strangers online. They react to every insult, every slight, every misunderstanding. They think noise equals strength, when in reality, it's usually the opposite. The most dangerous man in the room is rarely the loudest. He's the one watching, the one you can't read, the one who makes no effort to be understood because he doesn't need to be. Before we go deeper, write in the comments where you're watching this from. Let's see who's waking up, because this message is not for the ones who need to be seen. It's for the ones who are ready to become untouchable. Nietzsche believed that the strongest individuals are not the ones who impose themselves with words, but the ones who carry a silence so complete it becomes unsettling. He wrote of the quietest words, saying they bring the storm. That's the paradox. People mistake silence for weakness, but when you say nothing, you're not giving up your power. You're holding it tight. You're not showing your cards. You're making them guess. And when people have to guess who you are, what you think, or how far you're willing to go, they tread carefully. Machiavelli understood this too. In The Prince, he warned against transparency. He advised rulers to speak only when it served their purpose and to say only what must be said, nothing more. Why? Because information is leverage. The more you reveal, the easier you are to influence, manipulate, disarm. That's why the person who speaks the least in any room often controls the most. Everyone orbits around their silence. You don't need to win arguments when you no longer feel the urge to speak. You don't need to justify your choices, prove your worth, or chase validation. That kind of detachment is terrifying to those who feed on reaction. And that's exactly why silence is the ultimate weapon. It starves them. It confuses them. It gives you back control. You don't get that kind of presence by accident. You build it through self-discipline, psychological distance, and a deep understanding of human nature. This isn't about being passive. It's about becoming deliberate. You're not withdrawing from the game. You're studying the board, silently calculating your next move while everyone else is distracted by their own noise. And once you understand that, you stop talking to be heard and start speaking only when it matters, or not at all. There's something deeply unsettling about a person who refuses to be provoked. Think about it. When someone insults you, they expect pushback. When they try to bait you into defending yourself, they're waiting for the emotional payoff, your reaction. But when you say nothing, when you just look at them, unshaken, unmoved, completely composed, you short-circuit the entire game. Their strategy collapses because you didn't play your part. That's what most people don't understand. They think power is about dominating the conversation, winning debates, clapping back. But that's just theater. The real power is psychological, not verbal. It's in the person who controls their own mind to such a degree that no one else can drag them into chaos. That person becomes unpredictable, dangerous. And Nietzsche knew this. He once said, "He who cannot put his thoughts on ice should not enter into the heat of dispute." In other words, if you can't master your emotional impulse, you're not ready for war. You see, silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of control. When someone says something to provoke you and you don't respond, you send a message louder than words. You don't affect me. That's power. Not the power of dominance, but the power of indifference. You become untouchable, not because you fight harder, but because you refuse to be pulled into a fight that doesn't serve your interests. Machiavelli understood this on a strategic level. He believed that revealing emotion was a liability for anyone who wanted to hold influence. Why? Because the moment you expose what triggers you, what offends you, what makes you react, you've handed someone a weapon, and people will use it. That's why true power players never give away their center. They never argue to be right. They never try to be understood. They only act when it's calculated, never when it's emotional. And this isn't about arrogance or coldness. It's about sovereignty. It's about owning your space so completely that nobody else gets to dictate your emotional state. Most people don't live that way. They live in reaction. Someone cuts them off in traffic, they rage. Someone disrespects them, they spiral. But a man who has mastered the art of silence doesn't even blink, because he understands that not every provocation deserves a response. In fact, most don't. When you learn to sit with your emotions instead of releasing them for validation, you learn to hold a different kind of tension, a strategic tension, one that makes people lean in. That silence you carry, it becomes presence. A presence that doesn't need words to command attention. It just is. And that's where your strength begins to change shape, from something reactive to something absolutely immovable. We've been trained, almost from birth, to believe that silence is weakness, that if you don't speak up, you're powerless, that if you don't defend yourself, you're guilty. But this belief isn't truth, it's programming. Programming designed to make you predictable, because a reactive person is easy to control, easy to bait, easy to manipulate. But here's the harsh reality most people never accept. The world isn't fair, and justice doesn't come to those who cry the loudest. It comes to those who move the smartest. That's what Machiavelli taught. That silence is not submission, it's calculation. When you stay silent, you create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you choose your strategy. You don't just react, you decide. And the person who decides controls. Nietzsche understood this too, but from a psychological perspective. He saw how people waste their power through constant expression, through needing to be heard, to be validated, to be understood. He called this moral weakness, the compulsive need to express one's own virtue or victimhood in order to win social approval. But the strong don't beg to be understood, they act, and they let the outcome speak for itself. Now think about the last time someone insulted you, disrespected you, or tried to undermine you. Did you respond because it served you, or because you couldn't resist the urge? Did you step into that battle because it advanced your position, or because your ego couldn't handle the silence? That's where most people fail. They confuse pride with power. But pride is reactive. Power is selective. The one who controls the silence controls the tempo of the interaction. You don't have to win every argument. In fact, walking away from the argument without a word is the win. Because silence breaks the rhythm. It turns the attacker back onto themselves. They begin to question their effectiveness. Their confidence crumbles. Why? Because you didn't give them what they came for, your energy. And here's the deeper layer. Silence creates mystery. Mystery creates fear. People fear what they can't read, what they can't predict. When you're silent, people start projecting. They fill in the gaps with their own fears, their own insecurities. And 9 times out of 10, they overestimate you. That's the psychological advantage of silence. It forces people to fight their own mind. That's why, in a world where everyone is screaming to be seen, the person who says nothing often holds the most power. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they understand that silence isn't empty. It's loaded with presence, with control, with unpredictability. And in the game of power, that's everything. Silence doesn't just disarm others, it reveals them. Because the moment you go quiet, people start to show their cards. They talk more, they explain too much, they try to justify, clarify, impress, or provoke. Why? Because most people are deeply uncomfortable with silence. It's not just awkward for them, it's threatening. It makes them feel unseen, and more importantly, out of control. This is exactly what Machiavelli warned against, the mistake of always revealing your position. He believed that power doesn't come from expression, it comes from restraint, from making others move first while you stay still. When you're silent, you become the mirror. People project their motives, their fears, and their assumptions onto you. And if you're smart enough to listen, not just to their words, but to what's underneath, you'll learn everything you need to know. Nietzsche saw silence as a form of inner discipline. He didn't believe in wasting words to win petty battles. To him, the strong don't seek to correct every misunderstanding. They don't explain themselves to be liked. They don't react just to protect their image. Why? Because their self-worth doesn't depend on others. And that is the foundation of true power. Being untouchable, not because you're aggressive, but because you are rooted, still, clear. In fact, silence is often the only move that separates the master from the amateur. The amateur fights every battle. They argue in every room. They defend every part of themselves. But the master only speaks when silence would be less effective. And that doesn't happen often. So the next time someone pushes your buttons, tries to bait you, or corners you with judgment, don't rush to answer. Don't justify. Don't explain. Let them sit in their own discomfort. Let them wonder, because your silence is not a void. It's a force. And the longer you hold it, the more the other person begins to unravel. That's how silence wins, not by force, but by making the other side collapse under the weight of their own noise. There's a reason silence unnerves manipulative people. It removes the fuel they need to control you. Words, especially emotional, impulsive words, are data. And the more data you give, the more predictable and controllable you become. That's the first law in every psychological war. Never let your enemy know how you feel. Once they can map your reactions, they'll script your downfall in ways you won't even notice. Machiavelli would have called this a strategic failure, because when you speak too quickly, you reveal not only your stance but your need to be understood, to be liked, to be right. And need is weakness. It makes you easy to read and easy to move. The manipulator doesn't need strength to dominate you. They only need your neediness. That's why the smartest response to provocation is not a clever comeback, it's detachment. When you say nothing, you give nothing. No confirmation, no denial, no emotional energy for them to work with. You become a wall they can't climb, a shadow they can't grab. You disrupt the game entirely because they have no piece to play with anymore. They're forced to fill the silence with their own projections, their own insecurities. And often, they'll expose themselves without you lifting a finger. Nietzsche took this even further. He believed that the strongest individuals are those who don't need to prove their superiority. They live above the need to be heard, to correct, to defend. To him, speaking too much was a symptom of inner chaos. It showed that a person hadn't yet faced their own silence, their own depth. And until you do that, you're still reactive, you're still vulnerable. So silence isn't just about confusing others. It's about transforming yourself. It's a discipline, a way to train the ego. Every time you resist the urge to explain, to fix, to retaliate, you strengthen your internal power. You move from being emotionally owned by others to owning yourself completely. And in that ownership lies your edge, because the one who speaks the least in the room often sees the most, and the one who doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, doesn't argue, always has the final say, even if they never say a word. There's a certain kind of silence that unnerves people, not because it signals weakness, but because it holds a power they can't access. And the reason it's so threatening is simple. It removes control from their hands and returns it to yours. Most people depend on your reaction to validate their behavior. They count on your explanations, your defenses, your emotional responses to know they've got a grip on you. But the moment you stop offering those things, you stop being readable, you stop being predictable, and that terrifies them. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's a disruption. It breaks the rhythm of manipulation. When you don't defend yourself against an accusation, when you don't argue with someone's version of the story, when you don't flinch at the bait, that person has nothing to feed off of. You don't just starve their ego. You force them to confront something they never wanted to see, themselves. Machiavelli would call this psychological warfare. In The Prince, he writes that a wise ruler must conceal his intentions, remain composed, and never allow his enemies to see what truly moves him. He understood that most conflicts are won not through brute force or perfect arguments, but through poise. Silence is the art of not giving your opponent the weapons they need to wound you. It's not retreat, it's restraint, and restraint is strategy. Nietzsche, on the other hand, approached silence from the inside. For him, silence wasn't just a tactic, it was a sign of inner strength. He believed that those who constantly explain themselves, who seek validation or understanding from others, are still bound by a need to be accepted by the herd. But the higher individual, the Übermensch, has no such need. His silence is not weakness, it's self-sufficiency. It's sovereignty over impulse. It's the refusal to be reduced to someone else's expectations. And here's what most people don't understand. Silence doesn't make you passive. It makes you powerful. Because when you speak only when you choose, when your words are deliberate, measured, and rare, they carry weight. Every time you respond emotionally, you make yourself smaller, easier to read, easier to manipulate. But when you're quiet, calm, and composed, you force others to fill in the blanks. They start projecting, unraveling, second-guessing themselves. And in that unraveling, they reveal everything. The person who grows angry when you stop engaging, they were never listening to understand. They were listening to dominate. The person who panics when you pull back, they were never interested in connection. They were interested in control. And that's what silence shows you. It becomes a spotlight, not on you, but on them. So let them squirm. Let them try to provoke you, bait you, guilt you. Just sit with it. Watch, observe. Because the longer you stay silent, the louder their intentions become. You'll see who respects your boundaries and who only ever respected your availability. You'll see who's truly strong and who only looked that way when they had your reactions to lean on. Silence will cost you some people. But what you'll gain in clarity, power, and peace will be worth more than every argument you never had. Silence, at its highest level, doesn't just protect your peace, it transforms your presence. It shifts the balance in every interaction without you having to lift a finger. Because once you master silence, you don't just take your voice out of the game, you take your energy out of reach. And that changes everything. Let's be clear. In a world obsessed with instant reactions, with posting every thought, defending every opinion, and proving every point, choosing to say nothing is a declaration of power. Not silence out of fear, not silence out of submission, but chosen silence. Conscious, controlled, and intentional. That's what unnerves people. That's what breaks patterns. Because now, they can't figure you out. They can't predict you. They can't use your own words to trap you, because you're not giving them any. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But he also understood something subtler, that when you know your why, you don't need to explain your how. You don't owe your thought process to those who are only listening to argue. You don't owe your reasoning to people who will twist it to serve themselves. And you don't need to justify your silence to anyone who never earned your words in the first place. And Machiavelli, he knew this too. In The Art of War, he emphasized the value of unpredictability, of not revealing your next move. He wasn't just talking about battlefields. He was talking about power dynamics, politics, personal relationships. He understood that your enemy loses their advantage the moment they lose access to your intentions. And nothing protects your intentions like silence. This is why the strongest people in any room are often the quietest, not because they have nothing to say, but because they don't speak unless there's purpose. Their silence isn't awkward, it's calculated. It's not passive, it's dominant. And the moment they do speak, everyone listens, not out of politeness, but out of respect. Because when someone rarely talks, their words become rare, and what's rare becomes valuable. But there's a catch. This kind of silence demands emotional discipline. You have to be willing to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to correct someone who misunderstands you, to walk away from an insult without responding, to let people be wrong about you without needing to defend your character. That's hard. It goes against everything you were trained to do, especially if you grew up in environments where your voice was your only weapon. But here's the truth. Once you stop speaking from insecurity and start choosing your silence from strength, people notice. They start treating you differently. They become more careful, more measured, more cautious, because they can't predict what you'll do next. And in any dynamic, the person who controls the tone, not just the conversation, holds the power. That's what silence gives you. Not absence, not withdrawal, but influence. Quiet, steady, commanding influence. The kind that doesn't need a stage, a spotlight, or a microphone, because it resonates from within. Once you've mastered silence in confrontation, the next step is more subtle, but even more powerful. It's learning to use silence in success, in strategy, and in influence. Because silence isn't just a shield, it's leverage. And in the hands of someone who understands timing, it can shift the entire dynamic of a room, a negotiation, a relationship, or even a life path. Think of the most powerful people you've ever seen, whether in real life or in history. Did they explain themselves constantly? Did they jump to respond to every insult? Or did they make others come to them, make others lean in, wonder, second guess, feel off balance? That's no accident. That's the effect of studied silence. And that's why people who master it are so deeply intimidating. Because when you don't fill the space with noise, everyone else starts revealing themselves instead. When you go quiet, people start projecting. They assume things, they fill in the blanks, and more often than not, they reveal more about their own insecurities than they ever realize. This is where Nietzsche's insight becomes useful, not as a moralist, but as a psychologist of power. He knew that people fear what they cannot interpret, and nothing is harder to interpret than someone who doesn't speak unless they choose to. This is why in strategic environments, meetings, negotiations, power struggles, those who talk less usually win more. Because they listen better, because they calculate more, because they force others to show their hands first, and most of all, because they create a vacuum of uncertainty. And uncertainty is pressure. It makes others squirm. It makes them reveal weaknesses you can exploit. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake, especially if that mistake is talking too much. And here's something you won't hear in school. Most people expose their whole psychological profile just by speaking, how they crave validation, where they're wounded, what they're afraid of losing, how far they're willing to bend just to be accepted. All of it is in their words. But when you learn to say less on purpose, you deny people access to that map. You make them uncomfortable. They can't decode you, so they either respect you or fear you, often both. But let's be clear, this silence isn't about pretending to be deep or mysterious. That's just performance. The real thing is internal. It's the calm that comes from not needing to explain who you are, not needing to defend every decision, not needing to be understood by people who don't deserve access to your mind. Silence doesn't just change how people see you. It changes how you move. It teaches you to conserve your energy, to stop pouring your voice into people who won't hear it, and to stop wasting arguments on people committed to misunderstanding you. It turns your focus inward, toward refinement, toward precision, toward timing. Because the truth is, once you start using silence not as absence, but as presence, as precision, it becomes a kind of gravity. People start leaning toward you, watching your body language, waiting for your opinion. They may not admit it, but your restraint forces them to calibrate. That's power, not loud, not explosive, just constant, like pressure beneath the surface, controlled, directed, deadly. There comes a point after you've stopped defending, stopped over-explaining, stopped reacting, where silence stops being just a tactic and becomes a way of life, a philosophy, a baseline, not a game you play, but a truth you embody. Because when you reach that level, your silence doesn't just protect your energy, it defines your presence. Most people live in reaction. They respond to opinions, to pressure, to insults, to flattery. They're constantly adjusting themselves based on the expectations and emotional states of others. This is what Nietzsche referred to as the slave morality, a morality of the herd, of approval, of dependence. And the quickest way to stay enslaved to others is to always speak when spoken to always explain when questioned, to always give when someone demands your response. But the one who is truly free, the Übermensch, the self-directed human, doesn't play that game. Because his silence isn't submission, it's refusal. Refusal to be controlled by provocation, refusal to be drawn into emotional warfare, refusal to validate nonsense with attention, and most of all, refusal to live under the illusion that every truth must be shared or every thought justified. This is where silence becomes your sanctuary, not because you're hiding, but because you've made peace with solitude, with being misunderstood, with being underestimated. And that's where real strength begins. Because when you no longer fear being unseen, unheard, or misread, you become untouchable. And that's the paradox. The world teaches you to speak to survive, but power teaches you to withhold to thrive. When you stop giving everyone access to your voice, your thoughts, your emotions, you create distance. And in that distance, people begin to feel your presence more, not less. That's the strange magic of restraint. It draws attention without demanding it. It builds mystique without effort. It commands respect without begging for it. Machiavelli said, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." But he also knew the most dangerous kind of fear is the one that comes wrapped in silence. The kind where you never quite know where the other person stands. The kind where you can't read them, can't bait them, can't move them. That kind of silence is not just power, it's domination. And those who wield it don't need to win arguments because they've already won control of the frame. So here's the truth most people will never tell you. When you master silence, you stop losing energy to noise. You stop scattering your power. And you start consolidating it, word by word, choice by choice, silence by silence, until you become the one who speaks last, not loudest. And by then, the room already knows. When you choose to speak, it's not just noise, it's a verdict.